I want you to think about decisions that you make. Say you go to the store to buy some milk. How hard a decision is that? You see the milk on the shelf, you grab the kind that you want, you put it in your shopping cart, and you go and pay for it. Or maybe you go online and you look for some product that you're needing, and you see what you need, at least what you think that you need. You click, you put in your credit card number, and the purchase has been taken care of. Those are consumer decisions. They're rather simple to make, aren't they? I want you to think about moral decisions that you make, choices that have to do with right and wrong. Sometimes those involve confrontation. Maybe it's a confrontation with someone else, or maybe it's a group, or maybe it's even a crowd where we're trying to decide one thing and everybody else wants us to do something else. Maybe it's just in our own minds when we think about what is right and what is wrong, and we're trying to decide what we need to do. That's the background for what I want to talk about during this hour. And I've entitled the lesson, It's Decision Time. I'm thinking of a passage in 1 Kings chapter 18, in which the prophet Elijah confronts the people of Israel in terms of their making a decision concerning what God wants them to do. It's one of the chapters that we read recently in our daily Bible reading, and it bears deeper investigation, I believe. So let's take a few moments and look at 1 Kings chapter 18. As we journey back to that chapter, we're talking about a time in Israel's history where the kingdom had divided between, after a united kingdom under David and Saul and Solomon, it had divided at the end of Solomon's reign. In fact, if you go back to chapter 12, and we also read that chapter, there was a split in the kingdom during the rule of Rehoboam. Do you remember why that happened? Rehoboam went up to Shechem and he addressed the people. And the people asked him, are you going to make us serve like your father did? Or are you going to lighten the yoke that he had upon us? Rehoboam took that question and he confronted the older men who gave him counsel. And what they told him was, if you will serve the people, they will be your servants. But it says that he abandoned that counsel. He went instead to his young men, those with whom he had grown up. And their counsel was this: tell the people that my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. In other words, I'm tougher than he was. And so his answer to the people when they asked him after 3 days was, my father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. That message didn't resonate with most of the people. Jeroboam, who had been told by God that he would be a king, took the people and took 10 tribes of Israel and began to reign over them. But his reign had some results with it. At the end of chapter 12, Jeroboam surmised that if he allowed the people to go to Jerusalem for their worship, as they would customarily do, that he would lose their allegiance. And so he devised a form of worship that was different from what God had commanded. He set up golden calves, one each, in the cities of Dan and Bethel. Those were at the northern and the southern extremities of this new kingdom. In addition to that, he appointed priests, and he set up temples for the people to use as a place of worship. And then in verse 33, he devised a feast that was different from all other feasts that God had given to his people. This feast was to be on the 15th day of the 8th month. Listen to what verse 33 tells us. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day, in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel and went up to the altar to make offerings. The key there is that he devised this worship according to his own heart. He did what he wanted to do, not what God had instructed that he do. The die was cast for this northern kingdom of Israel. And then approximately 50 years later, Ahab ascends to the throne. And as he does so, he takes with him his wife Jezebel. Verse 31 of 1 Kings chapter 16 tells us about Ahab and Jezebel. It reads, "And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshiped him." What Ahab proceeded to do was to allow the worship of Baal in the land. There were shrines and temples and altars that began to appear everywhere. And God decided that he had had enough. This pagan worship was an affront to God, and he had warned long ago that if the people took this course, that there would be repercussion. And so in chapter 17 of 1 Kings, God sends the prophet Elijah. And Elijah announces that there will be no rain nor dew for these years except by my word. This was in keeping with the blessings and the cursings that God had given back when he delivered the law to Israel, that if they failed to keep his word, there would be consequences. And so Elijah was simply announcing the will of God to the people. Well, for 3.5 years, there was this drought, during which there was no rain. And then suddenly, after that period of time, Elijah called Obadiah to him, and he told Obadiah to announce to Ahab that he wanted to see the king. And when he confronts the king in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 17, Ahab says, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" He was placing the blame on Elijah for having announced the drought that had come upon the land. Of course, it wasn't Elijah's fault. Elijah was merely a spokesman for God. And then there is this great contest that unfolds in chapter 18. It takes place on Mount Carmel. Elijah calls for this confrontation. Here is a picture of that high plateau that sits up in the northern part of the kingdom in close proximity to the Mediterranean Sea. And it was here that Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal. This is the traditional site that is given as the place in which this confrontation takes place. I want you to notice verse 21 of 1 Kings chapter 18. As Elijah calls the prophets to himself, he confronts the people, and here's the question that he asks: how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And listen to the response. And the people did not answer him a word. It's hard to listen to that response because there really wasn't a response. Well, notice what takes place during this contest. Two bulls are set forward. One is given to the prophets of Baal. They place it upon their altar. And then they began to call out to Baal in order to send fire upon this offering. The text tells us that they cried out from morning until noon, and nothing happened. It reads, no one answered, no one paid attention. Note verse 28, and they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice. As I noted a moment ago, no one answered, no one paid attention. Imagine that scene in your mind. All of these prophets gathered around this altar, screaming and calling upon God, their God, Baal, to answer, and he does not answer. And so it was Elijah's turn. And he begins by mocking what these prophets had done and had said. Verse 27, at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god." He said, maybe he's musing. Maybe he's somewhere thinking. Maybe he's gone on vacation somewhere. Or maybe he's just nodded off to sleep. And someone needs to go and wake him up. And so Elijah rebuilt the altar that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel. He rebuilt the altar, and then he had the people pour water upon the offering. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, even a 4th time, until we're told that he had filled the trench that surrounded the offering. And so here's a waterlogged offering with this bull that has been placed upon it. And in verse 36, Elijah lifts up his voice to God. And here is his prayer: "O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." And you know the rest of the story. Fire came immediately and consumed the offering, the stones, it says, even the dust, and even the water in their trench. And the text tells us that the people fell on their face, and they proclaimed, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." You see, this confrontation changed their minds. They were ready to sign on the dotted line. Go back to that statement that Elijah made. That question that he asked, how long will you go limping between 2 different opinions? The Hebrew word there for opinion has to do with the idea of a tree that has a branch and the branch branches off. We sometimes use that terminology. And so what Elijah is asking them is, how long will it be before you decide upon a course of action? You can't go limping between 2 roads, 2 branches. You can't go hopping to one and then hopping to the other. In other words, what he's telling them to do is make a decision. There are only 2 paths, he tells them. You've got to either choose for God or choose for Baal. What Elijah told those people is just as true for us. We must decide how to live. Some of the older folks will remember Yogi Berra, who played catcher for the New York Yankees and then later managed that same club. And he was known for his witticisms. They were actually kind of humorous because they didn't really make much sense. Yogiisms, I think they've been called. One of those was that Yogi Berra said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Well, of course, you can't do that. You can't take both roads, both forks. You can't sit on the fence when it comes to right and wrong. When it comes to God, you're either for him or you're against him. Jesus said it this way in Matthew 6 and verse 24, "No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." That's true in so many different relationships. A decision has to be made. We can't be halfway in and halfway out. But sometimes that's exactly what we try to do. We waver, we dither, we procrastinate, instead of making a choice as to what is right. That sometimes happens in politics. I've read articles that have to do what is known as the mushy middle. Those are people who haven't made up their minds. And that might be typical in an election season where people are trying to surmise which candidate is best. But at some point, when they go into the polling booth, they've got to make up their minds. They've got to make a decision. I want to ask for our consideration, spiritually speaking, what enables us to make up our minds? Let me answer that question by first suggesting to you that there are some reasons that sometimes we don't decide. Sometimes we don't decide because, well, we think to ourselves, I've got good intentions. I haven't done anything yet, but I'm intending to do that. We all know what that's like, don't we? We might know what's right, but we just haven't got started. And let me say that good intentions are not necessarily a bad thing. We studied recently about David, who wanted to build a temple for God. That wasn't an evil thing on his part, but God told him, your son is the one who's going to build that temple. And David accepted the fact that God had made that decision. Good intentions are not sufficient, however, to suffice in place of the right kind of action. Sometimes a person might miss for a period of time being with God's people. And if you were to go to visit that person, they might say, well, I've been meaning to get back to services. Well, that's a good intention, but meaning to get back and getting back are two different things. Suppose a husband said to his wife, I've been meaning to be married to you. She wouldn't accept that as a justification for not doing what he's responsible to do. It's something that is important. Good intentions are not enough. There is procrastination. We've already mentioned that. It's easy to delay and think, there's a better time. I've got a desk at home. And for some reason, that desk tends to have papers and books pile up on it. And every morning that I sit down, I think, I need to clean this desk off, but I've got other things to do. And sometimes days and even weeks will go by before I take some time and just sort out things as far as my desk. You remember what Agrippa said to Paul when Paul had a hearing before him in Acts 26 and 28. Agrippa said at the end of Paul's statements, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? It may have been that Agrippa was convinced and persuaded by the arguments that Paul had made, but he was just looking for a better time for his response. It's so easy to think, not here, not now, not me, not us. Augustine was a so-called church father in the centuries after the establishment of the church. He made this statement: God has promised forgiveness to your repentance, but he has not promised tomorrow to your procrastination. There really are no guarantees as far as tomorrow is concerned. And the problem with procrastination is it can be very habit-forming. I heard or read the story about the man who was cleaning out his desk. He found a shoe repair ticket that was 10 years old. And so, figuring he had nothing to lose, he went to the shop and gave the ticket to the repairman, who began to search the back room for the unclaimed shoes. And after several minutes, he reappeared and gave the ticket back to the man. And the man said, "What's wrong? Couldn't you find my shoes?" "Oh, I found them," replied the repairman. "They'll be ready next Friday." You see, that procrastination can be so very inbuilt into our being. We can't procrastinate about an important decision, nor can we exercise what we might call denial syndrome. In order to solve a problem, we first have to admit the problem. You've probably heard that. How many addicts are there who convince themselves that they really don't have a problem, or that they can take care of that problem if they need to? The alcoholic who says, "This really isn't a problem. I can stop drinking anytime I want to." Someone with a drug problem. Many people deny a sin problem. They may think, well, I've done some things wrong in my life, but then they try to justify how it is that they're living, thinking that I can take care of that when I need to. The problem is that not making a decision is really making a decision. It's saying no to God. And we all have a sin problem. God sent his son in order to solve that sin problem. Israel had an idol problem. And so Elijah called upon them to decide. Let's think about how it is that God enables us to decide. God is an enabler, but in a good way. First of all, I would suggest to you that we can make a decision because really there are only two choices. Jesus said, you're either with me or you're against me. Once we realize that's the case, I think it's helpful to us. Our culture tries to convince us otherwise. It tries to paint a picture that says any decision you make is the right decision because you made it. And there are many paths by which we can get to the ultimate goals in our life. That's a different message from what Jesus taught. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, familiar words to us. Enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and listen, the way is hard that leads to life. It's not an easy path to take. And he adds, those who find it are few. There are only two choices. We can either serve to choose God, or we can reject him. Once we consider that, it's helpful to us, and it may just take some courage for us to act upon that decision. Over in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, Peter lists some characteristics that we are to add to our life. He starts with faith, but then he says to faith, add virtue. Virtue is a moral excellence, trying to be the very best that we can be, but it also includes the idea of courage. Courage means that sometimes we have to swim against the current. When everybody else is going the other way, it might be public opinion, it might be peer pressure, it might be trying to avoid confrontation. We don't want to upset anyone, or we don't want attention drawn to ourselves. But virtue, courage, says that we're going to choose what is right. Let me suggest a third point, and that is God gives us compelling evidence that enables us to choose. It's not just a matter of looking inside myself and deciding what I think is best. That's not the kind of evidence that Elijah gave to the people of Israel. He called down fire from heaven in order to consume the offering that was before them. That was something objective that they could see with their own eyes, and it was convincing. So someone might say today, well, I would decide to serve God if he would send fire from heaven in order to consume an offering. Let me tell you, God has sent evidence in the form of Jesus, his son. C.S. Lewis has a quotation where he talks about the fact that you've got to make a decision about Jesus as either being the Son of God or not. There is no middle ground. Listen to what he says. He writes, I am ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God, but let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, we could go on and cite evidence that the four Gospels give us about who Jesus is, what he did, and how he demonstrated himself to be the Son of God. That is the compelling evidence that allows us to choose to serve him. But finally, as we've really suggested throughout, we need to make a decision. There is no neutrality when it comes to God. Being a Christian requires a determined effort to do better, to do more, to do the right thing, to do the unpopular thing, even when no one else does it, to do what needs to be done. It requires commitment. It requires devotion. It requires courage and diligence. But most of all, it requires a decision. Let me ask you as I close, what decision do you need to make in your life? There are some who may be listening to our live stream this afternoon, and you have not decided to follow Jesus as your Lord, as he claims to be the Son of God. That's a decision that you need to make, not tomorrow, but now at this point in time. If it's a matter of study, then open up your New Testament and study. But make a decision. Maybe as Christians, we need to make a decision to serve God with more zeal, to be more serious about our worship or Bible study or helping others or doing the things that we need to do. As I suggest here on the chart, there is no neutrality when it comes to serving God. Our word neutral comes from a couple of Latin words that mean not either. You've got to make a choice. It's decision time. Who are we going to choose? We can't continue to act between two different sides. We've got to make a choice when it comes to God. And my prayer and my hope is that you will decide for him, that you will decide to serve his Son, Jesus Christ, in your life.